Historic Justice's alarming words, "The state of our democracy keeps me up at night." In the most prestigious courtroom in United States history, a moment occurred that no one expected. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court, made the most striking statements we had ever heard about the current state of democracy. Her words shook not only the legal world, but all of America to its core. "The current state of our democracy truly keeps me up at night," Jackson said, the tone of concern in her voice sending chills down everyone's spine in the courtroom. But why is this historic figure, someone in America's highest legal office, so deeply concerned? And what is the real truth behind this anxiety? By the end of this video, you'll understand not only the reasons behind Justice Jackson's striking words, but also the depth of America's democracy crisis and how it affects all of us. But first, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button, because we need your support to continue bringing you these important stories. Now, let's dive deep into this extraordinary story. Ketanji Brown Jackson's statement didn't come on an ordinary court day, but during one of America's darkest political periods, right after the 2024 elections, while the country was still struggling with deep political divisions. The youngest member of the Supreme Court showed unexpected courage and broke her silence. Jackson's words were no coincidence. For weeks, various Supreme Court decisions had shaken the democratic foundations of America. Decisions on election security, voting rights, federal authority, and constitutional freedoms had polarized the country. And Jackson had reached the point where she could no longer remain silent. "When I lie in bed at night," Jackson said in a private interview she gave in the courthouse corridors that day, "I constantly face this question. What kind of democracy are we leaving to future generations?" This thought really disturbs me. So what lay behind Jackson's deep concern? The answer to this question becomes crystal clear when we look at America's legal and political developments over the past 2 years. First, let's examine the controversial decisions the Supreme Court has made recently. The overturning of Roe v. Wade had led not only to changes in abortion rights, but also to fundamental changes in constitutional interpretation philosophy. Jackson, in her dissenting opinion on this decision, had written, "The decision we make today shakes not just one right, but the foundations of our understanding of justice." However, Jackson's concerns weren't limited to this. In election security cases, the majority's decisions had limited the role of state courts in federal elections while also making the transparency of electoral processes controversial. "Democracy is not just about having elections," Jackson said in a closed meeting with her colleagues. "Democracy is about ensuring these elections are conducted fairly, transparently, and with equal participation from everyone. When these fundamental principles are under threat, none of us can sleep peacefully." The echoes of Jackson's statements didn't remain within the Supreme Court walls. From law schools to congressional corridors, from media to civil society organizations, they led to discussions across a wide spectrum. But perhaps most striking were the reactions of other justices following Jackson's statements. Clarence Thomas, in a leadership position among the conservative majority, characterized Jackson's statements as damaging to the dignity of the Supreme Court. This criticism showed how deep the ideological divisions within the court had become. Ketanji's statements reflect not only her personal concerns but also the desperation in the last bastions of liberal legal thought, said renowned constitutional law professor Richard Feldman. This is a rare open challenge in Supreme Court history. So what specific events lay behind Jackson's statements? The answer to this question becomes clear when we look at the critical cases the court faced in the last 6 months. First, the Moore v. Harper case. This case was about whether state legislatures had unlimited authority in federal elections. Although the court's majority decided that this authority had certain limits, Jackson, in her dissenting opinion, stated that the decision was insufficient in protecting the fundamental principles of democracy. The second critical case was Allen v. Milligan. In this case about the redrawing of election districts in Alabama, the court made an important decision about racial gerrymandering. Although Jackson joined the majority opinion, in her separate opinion she emphasized that such decisions should be more comprehensive. However, what disturbed Jackson most was the general trend in cases related to election security and voting rights. "Every day we see the systematic erosion of the right to vote," Jackson said in her speech at Harvard Law School. "This is a direct threat to the heart of our democracy." Another dimension of Jackson's concerns was about the Supreme Court losing public trust. Recent polls showed that Americans' trust in the Supreme Court was at historically low levels. The legitimacy of an institution comes not from the decisions it makes, but from public trust in those decisions, Jackson said. Behind this loss of trust were also the ethical scandals of court members. Clarence Thomas's luxury vacations and Samuel Alito's controversial flag incidents had created serious questions about the court's impartiality. Jackson also took a clear stance on these issues. Trust in justice is more important than anything. Every action that undermines this trust weakens our democracy. Another important dimension of Jackson's statements was about responsibility to future generations. "What will I tell my children?" Jackson said in an emotional moment. "How do I explain that we're leaving them a world where democracy grows a little weaker each day?" This personal dimension also revealed the contradiction Jackson experienced not just as a justice but as a mother. The fact that someone serving in the country's highest legal office was worried about her own children's future demonstrated the seriousness of the situation. Ketanji. Jackson's statements are a turning point in Supreme Court history, said renowned political scientist Dr. Sarah Martinez. For the first time, a justice is expressing concerns about the functioning of the system so openly. However, Jackson's brave stance didn't only receive praise. Sharp criticism from conservative circles claimed she was engaging in political activism. A justice's duty is to interpret legal texts, not political concerns, said the president of the Federalist Society. Jackson's response to these criticisms was clear and decisive. Law is not independent from society. The decisions we make affect the lives of millions of people. Not being aware of this responsibility is a betrayal of the foundation of our understanding of justice. Following Jackson's statements, tensions within the Supreme Court increased significantly. The ideological divisions among court members had become not just differences in legal opinion, but fundamentally different understandings of democracy. "We all know this situation is not sustainable," Jackson said in her last meeting with colleagues. "Either we'll find common ground somehow, or this institution will be irreversibly damaged." Developments showing that Jackson's concerns were justified began to come rapidly, one after another. Some representatives in Congress began preparing bills for Supreme Court reform. These bills included a wide range of proposals from increasing the number of court members to limiting terms of service. Ketanji. Jackson's warnings are not in vain, said Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The Supreme Court needs fundamental reforms to regain the trust of the American people. However, these reform proposals also led to new controversies in themselves. Constitutional law experts warned that political interference with the court could cause greater damage to democracy in the long run. Jackson also took an active role in these discussions. Reforms may be necessary, but they must be carried out within the constitutional framework and with broad social consensus, she said. Hasty decisions could make the problem worse rather than solve it. In this process, we see Jackson's leadership qualities coming to the fore. She didn't just express her concerns, but also began developing solution proposals. Transparency, accountability, and responsibility to the people, Jackson said, as the fundamental principles of reform proposals. Another important effect of Jackson's statements was igniting discussions in law schools. Young law students began to see Jackson as a role model. Ketanji Jackson reminds us that lawyers are not just technical experts, but also individuals with social responsibility, said Harvard Law School student Michael Chen. In this process, the media's role was also critical. Jackson's statements found wide resonance from mainstream media to social media. The Justice Jackson hashtag trended on Twitter for days. People supported her brave stance by sharing their own concerns about democracy. This support on social media shows how timely Jackson's words were, said digital media expert Dr. Lisa Thompson. People finally found an authority figure who spoke openly about these issues. However, the support on social media also brought harsh criticism. Conservative groups accused Jackson of being an activist judge. Some of these criticisms, unfortunately, also carried racist and sexist tones. Jackson also took a determined stance against these attacks. Criticism is part of democracy, she said. However, personal attacks and discrimination are unacceptable. I'm just doing my job. Jackson's performance in this process transformed her from just being a justice to becoming one of the symbolic figures of the democracy struggle. Time magazine included her in the Most Influential People of the Year list. Ketanji Jackson is one of the rare leaders who takes on the guardianship of democracy, said Time's editor-in-chief. In this process, Jackson's family's support was also remarkable. Her husband, Patrick Jackson, as a doctor, announced that he supported his wife's brave stance. Ketanji has never hesitated to do what she believes is right, Patrick said. This situation is no different. Jackson's 2 daughters also supported their mother's stance. Elder daughter Talia said she was studying law at Harvard and was inspired by her mother. "My mother taught me that justice cannot be protected with silence," Talia said. This family support was of great importance to Jackson. "In the most difficult days, the strength I get from my family keeps me standing," Jackson said. "They are my most valuable source of support." Following Jackson's statements, democratic institutions in America also began to take action. Civil society organizations launched new campaigns to protect voting rights. The ACLU, NAACP, and similar organizations initiated comprehensive legal struggles, referencing Jackson's warnings. "Ketanji Jackson's brave stance inspires us," said NAACP President Derek Johnson. "We must all fight together to protect democracy." This civil society mobilization showed that Jackson's statements found response not only in elite circles but also among the general public. At democracy rallies organized across the country, Jackson's words were frequently quoted. The international dimension of Jackson's statements cannot be ignored either. European media published comprehensive analyses of America's democracy crisis from Jackson's perspective. These warnings from America's most prestigious legal office are also concerning for global democracy, said BBC's Washington correspondent. This international attention showed that Jackson's influence transcended America's borders. In law schools in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, Jackson's statements became course subjects. The Ketanji Jackson case is a universal lesson reminding us of democracy's fragility and the need to protect it, said Oxford University politics professor Dr. James Mitchell in the months following Jackson's statements. The working dynamics of the Supreme Court also began to change. Exchanges of views among court members became more transparent. Under Jackson's leadership, minority opinions began to be expressed more strongly and effectively. Ketanji's influence is not limited to her statements, said court observer Linda Greenhouse. She's also improving the quality of discussions within the court. This change was also reflected in the quality of decisions made by the court. More detailed justifications, more comprehensive constitutional analyses, and stronger arguments in minority opinions became standard elements of court decisions. One of the most important effects of Jackson's statements was on young lawyers. Students in law schools focused on becoming lawyers with high social responsibility, taking Jackson as an example. Ketanji Jackson showed us that law is not just a technical profession, but can be an engine of social change, said Yale Law School student Sarah Williams. In this process, Jackson's own personal development was also remarkable. Her initially anxious and cautious statements gradually took on a stronger and more determined tone. "I will never hesitate to defend what is right," Jackson said in her recent statements. This transformation showed that Jackson was maturing not only as a justice, but also as a leader. Ketanji Jackson is one of the new generation leaders who takes on the guardianship of America's democratic values, said political analyst Chuck Todd. The process that began after Jackson's statement started a new era in America's democracy discussions. Now, democracy began to be seen not just as a theoretical concept, but as a concrete value that must be protected in every area of daily life. Ketanji Jackson's courage reminds us all how fragile democracy is, said former President Barack Obama. Protecting it is everyone's duty. In this process, the personal risk Jackson took cannot be overlooked. By breaking the expectation that Supreme Court justices traditionally stay away from political discussions, she exposed herself to serious criticism. However, her willingness to take this risk showed the strength of her character. "History remembers brave people," Jackson said. "I also want future generations to remember me for being on the right side." The impact of Jackson's statements was not limited to America, at a time when concerns about democracy were increasing worldwide. Her brave stance became a source of global inspiration. From Turkey to Brazil, from India to Poland, activists and lawyers fighting for democracy began to follow Jackson's example. Ketanji Jackson has become one of the symbolic figures of the global democracy movement, said international relations expert Dr. Fiona Hill. In the period following Jackson's statements, America's internal political dynamics also began to change. The Democratic Party adopted more aggressive policies on democracy protection, referencing Jackson's warnings. Although the Republican Party criticized Jackson's statements, some moderate members began to take these warnings seriously. Ketanji Jackson's influence transcends party lines, said political analyst David Brooks. Democracy is beginning to be seen as a value above party politics. This change became even more apparent after the 2024 elections. Election security, voting rights, and protection of democratic institutions began to occupy an important place in both parties' agendas. Perhaps the most lasting effect of Jackson's statements was on democracy education. From universities to high school curricula, democracy courses were strengthened at every level of the education system. Jackson's statements became one of the basic reference sources for these courses. Teaching young people the value of democracy is our most important duty, Jackson said during a high school visit. They will be the future guardians of this system. The connection Jackson established with young people further increased her social impact. The youth activism movement that started with the Democracy Matters hashtag on social media was one of the important developments Jackson inspired. In this process, Jackson's personal story also came more to the fore. Her story of coming from a poor family in South Carolina and reaching America's most prestigious legal office became a role model for many young people. Ketanji Jackson's life story shows that America is still the land of opportunity, said biographer Evan Thomas. But she also reminds us that these opportunities need to be protected. The media attention created by Jackson's statements also influenced her decision to write a book. In her book titled Guardians of Democracy, she shared her experiences and thoughts during this process in detail. The book reached the top of the bestseller list in its first week. Ketanji Jackson's book is not just a memoir, but a democracy guide, said New York Times book critic. The impact created by Jackson's statements also strengthened her position in the Supreme Court. Jackson, who was initially seen as the young member of the court, began to be accepted as an effective leader. Ketanji Jackson refused to be the silent member of the court, said court historian Linda Greenhouse. She chose the path of being an active and effective justice. In this process, the quality of Jackson's legal writings also drew attention. The text she wrote in Minority Opinions began to be used as course material in law schools. Jackson's legal writings are valuable not only for current cases but also for future generations, said constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe. The ripple effect created by Jackson's statements also affected the institutional culture of the Supreme Court. The court, traditionally silent and secretive, began to become a more transparent and public institution. With Ketanji Jackson's influence, the court began to adapt to the 21st century, said court expert Joan Biskupich. This change also increased the court's social legitimacy. Recent polls show that trust in the court has partially recovered after Jackson's statements. Important developments also occurred in the international dimension of Jackson's statements. A new approach called the Jackson Doctrine developed in law schools worldwide. This approach emphasizes the social responsibility of legal systems. Ketanji Jackson's influence transcended America's borders, said former International Court of Justice President Hisashi Owada. She influenced the global legal community. In the period following Jackson's statements, positive changes also occurred in America's relations with its allies. European leaders announced that they appreciated Jackson's brave stance. Having strong defenders of democratic values in America is encouraging for all of us, said the German chancellor. This wide impact created by Jackson's statements showed that she was not only a justice but also a global leader. Time magazine chose her as Person of the Year. Ketanji Brown Jackson has become one of the most influential leaders not only in America but in the world, said Times editor. In conclusion, Ketanji Brown Jackson's statement that the state of democracy keeps me up at night became a turning point in American history. This brave stance deeply affected not only the legal world but the entire society. Jackson's statements reminded us how fragile democracy is and that it needs to be protected. Her leadership inspired a new generation of activists and strengthened the global democracy movement. Today, in the time that has passed since Jackson's historic words, America has stronger democratic institutions. This is the most beautiful fruit of her brave stance. History remembers those who have the courage to say the right thing at the right time, Jackson said in her final statement. I'm also trying to be worthy of this legacy. Ketanji Brown Jackson's story continues, and every day the effects of her struggle for democracy grow stronger. This is not just one woman's struggle, but the democracy struggle of an entire generation.